Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most intriguing what-if scenarios, imagining a secret alliance of medieval women that stretched across kingdoms, connected abbesses to queens, and created the world's first informal women's rights organization centuries before anyone dared speak such words aloud. Picture yourself walking through the shadowy corridors of a 12th century convent, where whispered conversations between hooded figures aren't about prayers, but about trade routes, political marriages, and the careful orchestration of power behind the scenes. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, about how certain medieval women achieved remarkable influence despite living in a world designed to silence them. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video. Or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Feel free to let me know where and when you started watching tonight, or perhaps share what draws you to these historical mysteries. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the year 1147, standing in the solar of Eleanor of Aquitaine's palace, watching as she breaks the wax seal on yet another letter that arrived through channels no male courier could have traced. The parchment bears no official insignia, yet Eleanor's eyes light up with recognition as she reads words written in a code that sounds like casual gossip about embroidery patterns, but actually contains detailed intelligence about troop movements along the Rhine. This isn't unusual. Across medieval Europe, a vast network of women has been quietly communicating for decades, sharing everything from political secrets to medical remedies, creating what historians would recognize today as the world's first international women's organization. The roots of this network stretch back to the most unlikely of places, the pilgrimage routes that crisscross Europe like ancient highways. You watch as Lady Matilda of Tuscany, travelling to Santiago de Compostela in 1089, strikes up conversations with fellow female pilgrims at roadside inns. What begins as shared prayers and complaints about saddle sores gradually evolves into something more substantial. These women, noble ladies, wealthy merchants' wives, and powerful abbesses realise they face similar challenges regardless of which kingdom they call home. Their husbands and fathers control their lands. The church limits their spiritual authority, and their sons inherit everything while their daughters receive dowries that disappear into their husbands' treasuries. But here's where medieval women proved far more clever than anyone suspected. They turned the very restrictions placed upon them into their greatest strengths, since women were expected to be pious. Their frequent visits to religious houses aroused no suspicion. A countess travelling to donate gold candlesticks to a distant monastery might actually be carrying encoded messages about grain prices and military alliances. Historians still argue whether these early communications were truly coordinated, or simply the natural result of shared interests, but surviving letters suggest something far more organised than coincidental gossip. The network grows organically, like ivy finding every crack in a stone wall. You observe how Abbess Hildegard of Bingen doesn't just correspond with other religious houses about theological matters, she also shares detailed observations about political tensions, unusual weather patterns affecting harvests, and the movements of various armies. Her letters reach not only fellow nuns, but also secular noblewomen who have learned to value her insights. When Hildegard writes to Eleanor of Aquitaine about spiritual revelations, seasoned readers understand she's actually providing intelligence about the Holy Roman Emperor's latest political manoeuvring. The irony that the Church's own emphasis on literacy for religious women creates their greatest threat to male authority isn't lost on the more perceptive observers of the time. The beauty of this early system lies in its invisibility. Medieval society expects women to write letters about family news, religious devotion, and domestic concerns, No one suspects that Lady Bertha's chatty note about her daughter's wedding preparations actually contains detailed information about her son-in-law's military resources and political allegiances. The code develops naturally. A mention of rose embroidery might indicate a peaceful resolution to a territorial dispute, while thorny brambles in the garden could warn of impending conflict. Women discussing the proper techniques for preserving fruits might actually be sharing methods for storing grain during sieges. While complaints about unruly servants often contain intelligence about the loyalty of various noble houses, you notice how the network particularly thrives in the textile trade, where women hold genuine economic power. The wives and daughters of cloth merchants travel regularly between major trading cities, carrying more than just samples of fine woolens and silks. They transport messages, small valuable items, and most importantly, trust between distant allies. When the Flemish textile markets flourish, these women ensure that Italian silk producers know about new dyeing techniques, while Spanish wool merchants learn about changing fashion preferences in northern courts. The great trade fairs at Champagne become informal headquarters for this growing sisterhood, where a casual conversation about thread quality might actually be a detailed briefing on the financial stability of various kingdoms. The religious houses serve as crucial nodes in this growing web of communication. Convents and abbeys maintain scriptoriums where educated nuns can read and write in multiple languages, making them ideal message centres. You watch as a travel-worn messenger approaches the gates of Fontevraud Abbey, carrying what appears to be a routine delivery of religious texts. But hidden within the binding of a psalter lies a thin strip of parchment containing urgent news about political developments in distant Normandy. The abbess reads it, memorizes the contents, burns the original, and within hours, copies of this intelligence begin their journey toward other network members across France and beyond. What makes this network particularly ingenious is how it exploits medieval society's blind spots regarding women's capabilities. Male nobles assume their wives' correspondence involves nothing more serious than recipes and gossip about court fashions. They're partially right. These letters do contain discussions of cooking techniques and clothing styles, but embedded within seemingly innocent domestic chatter lies a sophisticated intelligence apparatus that would make even modern spy networks envious. A recipe for preserving fish might actually be instructions for maintaining loyalty among retainers during extended absences, while detailed descriptions of new dress patterns could contain architectural observations about castle fortifications. As you witness these early days of the network, you begin to understand how medieval women transformed their supposed weaknesses into unprecedented strengths, creating an information system that spans continents and connects cultures. The stage is set for something even more remarkable. The day when this loose collection of correspondence would dare to imagine themselves as something far more ambitious than a simple network of allies. The transformation from scattered correspondence to organised alliance begins on a fog-shrouded morning in 1152, when you find yourself approaching the remote Benedictine monastery of Saint Wandrille in Normandy. The abbey sits like a stone fortress against the grey sky, its walls concealing what will become history's most audacious gathering of medieval women. Inside the guest quarters, representatives from across Europe have arrived under various pretenses: pilgrimage, family visits, religious retreats, but their true purpose runs far deeper than devotion. You slip into the shadows of the chapter house as 23 women take their seats in a rough circle, their faces illuminated by flickering candles. Eleanor of Aquitaine sits beside Abbess Heloise, whose legendary intellect has drawn women scholars from across Christendom. Next to them, you recognise Matilda of England, whose claim to the English throne has taught her bitter lessons about the limitations placed on female power. The Countess of Flanders represents the merchant interests that fuel much of Europe's economy, while several other abbesses bring the spiritual authority that legitimizes their gathering. The diversity is striking, ages ranging from 19 to 67, speaking in Latin, French, German, and Italian, united only by their shared frustration with a world that underestimates their capabilities. The woman who calls this meeting to order surprises everyone, Lady Ermengarde of Narbonne, whose strategic position in southern France has made her a crucial link between Christian and Islamic territories. Her voice carries the authority of someone accustomed to commanding armies, yet she speaks in hushed tones that barely rise above the monastery's whispered prayers echoing from the chapel nearby. She begins by acknowledging what everyone already knows. Their informal network has grown beyond simple correspondence into something that demands structure, purpose, and protection. The irony isn't lost on anyone that they're meeting in a house of God to discuss activities that most priests would consider dangerously close to rebellion. You watch as Ermengarde outlines the challenges they all face. The Second Crusade has destabilized traditional power structures, creating opportunities for clever women but also exposing them to greater dangers. Kings and emperors increasingly view their wives and daughters with suspicion, recognizing that these seemingly powerless women somehow know too much about supposedly secret military plans and diplomatic negotiations. Several recent incidents have been particularly alarming. The Duchess of Burgundy questioned aggressively about her knowledge of troop movements she shouldn't have been privy to. And the Abbess of Quedlinburg nearly accused of witchcraft when her prophecies about political developments proved unnervingly accurate. The time has come, Ermengarde argues, to formalise their alliance before their enemies fully comprehend what they're confronting. But formalisation brings risks of its own, and the debate that follows reveals the complexity of medieval women's position in society. Abbess Heloise argues for a purely intellectual organisation focused on preserving and sharing knowledge, particularly the works of ancient authors that male scholars often ignore or misinterpret. She envisions libraries connected across Europe, where female scholars could access texts regardless of political boundaries. Her vision appeals to the religious women present, who see education as their pathway to influence. She describes a network of scriptoriums where nuns could copy not only religious texts, but also works on mathematics, medicine, and natural philosophy that are slowly disappearing as monasteries focus increasingly on theological debates rather than practical learning. But Eleanor of Aquitaine pushes for something more politically active, an organisation that could coordinate responses to threats against any member, potentially even influencing the outcomes of wars and succession disputes. She reminds the group of recent cases where women faced imprisonment, forced marriages, or worse, simply because they lacked powerful allies to protect them. Eleanor's own experiences during the Second Crusade, where she commanded troops and made strategic decisions that male chroniclers later attributed to her husband, have convinced her that women must claim power actively rather than hoping for gradual acceptance. Historians still argue whether the women at this gathering understood the revolutionary nature of what they were proposing. Creating any organisation that operated independently of male authority challenged the fundamental assumptions of medieval society, where every person was supposed to exist within a clear hierarchy, leading ultimately to male rulers and the Pope. Yet these women had already been operating outside traditional structures for decades, and their success emboldened them to imagine even greater possibilities. The Countess of Flanders brings a merchant's practical perspective to the discussion, pointing out that their network already influences trade relationships across Europe. She proposes expanding this economic cooperation, coordinating everything from currency exchanges to shipping routes. Her suggestion that they could potentially manipulate grain prices to pressure hostile rulers into peace negotiations draws sharp intakes of breath from some participants. But knowing nods from others who have already experimented with such tactics on smaller scales, The Countess reveals that textile merchants loyal to network members have successfully coordinated boycotts of certain regions, forcing local rulers to modify oppressive policies toward women in order to restore trade relationships. You observe how the group grapples with questions of membership and loyalty. Should they restrict their alliance to Christian women, or risk controversy by including Jewish merchants and even Muslim contacts in territories like Sicily and Iberia? The debate grows heated when several abbesses express concern about associating with women they consider heretical. But Eleanor's pragmatic voice cuts through theological objections. Their strength lies in information and connections, she argues, and artificial religious boundaries only weaken their potential influence. She points out that some of their most valuable intelligence about military movements and political developments comes from Jewish traders who travel freely between Christian and Muslim territories. The most contentious discussion centers on secrecy versus openness. Some argue for complete concealment, believing that any public acknowledgement of their alliance would invite immediate suppression by threatened male authorities. The recent accusations of witchcraft against several prominent women who showed too much knowledge of worldly affairs serve as sobering reminders of what happens when female intelligence becomes too visible. Others contend that operating entirely in shadows limits their effectiveness and makes them vulnerable to accusations of conspiracy. The compromise they reach reflects medieval women's sophisticated understanding of power dynamics. They will maintain public facades of traditional feminine roles, while privately coordinating activities that gradually expand their influence. Lady Ermengarde suggests a brilliant solution to their visibility problem. They will present themselves as a religious sisterhood dedicated to charitable works and spiritual contemplation, which gives them perfect cover for extensive correspondence, travel, and meetings. Religious authority protects them from most secular interference, while their apparent focus on prayer and charity deflects suspicion from their more political activities. As dawn light begins filtering through the chapter house windows, you witness the moment when informal networking transforms into organized alliance. The women agree to meet again within 2 years, but first they must establish communication protocols, membership criteria, and basic operating principles. They designate certain abbeys as safe havens where members can seek refuge, create standardized codes for sensitive communications, and establish emergency procedures for protecting members who face immediate threats from hostile authorities. The meeting concludes with something unprecedented in medieval history. Women from different kingdoms swearing mutual oaths of support that supersede their traditional loyalties to fathers, husbands, and rulers, as each woman places her hand on a gospel book and promises to aid her sisters regardless of political boundaries. You realize you're witnessing the birth of Europe's first truly international organization, centuries before the concept of international cooperation would be formally recognized by male-dominated institutions. But even as these women celebrate their historic agreement, shadows of future challenges already loom. Creating their alliance was the easy part compared to the tasks that lie ahead. Drafting a formal charter that balances idealism with practical security concerns. Establishing operational procedures that can function across vast distances and cultural differences. And most dangerously, maintaining their cover while gradually increasing their influence over the very societies that would destroy them if their true purpose were discovered. 6 months after the Saint Wandrille gathering, you find yourself in the scriptorium of Fontevraud Abbey, where the soft scratch of quill pens on parchment creates a rhythm as hypnotic as a prayer chant. The autumn light filtering through narrow windows illuminates 3 women hunched over a writing desk, their faces intense with concentration as they craft what will become the founding document of their revolutionary alliance. Sister Marie-Claire, the Abbey's most skilled scribe, carefully forms each Latin letter, while Eleanor of Aquitaine dictates, and Abbess Petronilla of Chamille suggests theological language that will help their charter survive scrutiny from suspicious church authorities. The document they're creating must perform an almost impossible balancing act, establishing clear principles and procedures for their alliance, while appearing to any outside observer like a conventional religious rule for pious women. You watch as they struggle with fundamental questions that wouldn't be formally addressed by political theorists for centuries. How do you create binding agreements between people who supposedly have no legal authority? How do you establish international law when the very concept doesn't officially exist? Their solution demonstrates the sophisticated political thinking that medieval women developed out of necessity. They begin their charter with language borrowed from monastic rules, declaring their organisation to be a congregation of holy sisters united in service to God and Christian charity. But hidden within seemingly innocent religious phrases lies revolutionary content. When they write about mutual support in times of spiritual testing, experienced readers understand this means military protection for members facing hostile rulers. References to sharing the fruits of contemplation actually describe intelligence gathering and distribution, while promises to maintain correspondence for spiritual edification establish their communication network as a religious duty rather than political conspiracy. The membership requirements they establish reveal how carefully they've thought about security and effectiveness. New members must be proposed by at least 2 existing sisters and demonstrate both practical skills and absolute discretion. They create a probationary period disguised as spiritual testing, during which candidates prove their reliability by successfully completing increasingly sensitive tasks. The Charter specifies that members must be able to read and write in at least 2 languages, have access to resources that could assist other sisters, and maintain positions that provide useful information or influence. You observe how they address the delicate question of loyalty conflicts. Medieval women owe obedience to fathers, husbands, feudal lords, and religious superiors, creating potential contradictions with alliance obligations. Their solution is characteristically ingenious. They frame their mutual obligations as spiritual duties that transcend worldly concerns, essentially arguing that their loyalty to each other represents loyalty to a higher divine calling. This theological framework provides protection against accusations of treason or rebellion, since medieval law generally recognizes religious obligations as superior to secular ones. The Charter establishes a governance structure that reflects both practical necessity and revolutionary thinking, rather than appointing a single leader who could become a target for enemies. They create a council system where authority rotates among regional representatives. Historians still argue whether this represents genuine democratic impulses or simply pragmatic recognition that centralized leadership would be too vulnerable to attack. The document carefully avoids using terms like authority or command, instead describing their leaders as elder sisters who offer guidance and coordinate charitable activities. Their economic arrangements demonstrate sophisticated understanding of medieval finance and law. The Charter establishes a common treasury disguised as a fund for charitable works, with contributions calculated according to each member's resources and recorded in coded account books that appear to track donations for poor relief. They create procedures for emergency loans between members, currency exchange services for travelling sisters, and even a primitive form of insurance where the organisation supports the families of members who face political persecution. One of the most remarkable sections addresses what they diplomatically call educational cooperation. The Charter establishes procedures for sharing books, supporting female scholars, and creating hidden libraries where controversial texts can be preserved. They commit to maintaining schools for girls in regions where such education is discouraged, funding them through seemingly innocent charitable donations. The document even includes provisions for supporting women who want to study medicine, mathematics, or natural philosophy, subjects typically forbidden to females. The Charter's treatment of marriage reveals how deeply they understand the challenges facing medieval women. They establish protocols for investigating potential husbands, sharing information about the treatment women receive in different noble houses, and even coordinating strategic marriage alliances that serve their members' interests rather than just their family's political goals. Most audaciously, they create procedures for helping women escape forced marriages or abusive situations, using their network to provide refuge and legal support. You notice how they address religious diversity within their alliance. Despite initial objections from some abbesses, the final charter includes carefully worded provisions for cooperating with Jewish and Muslim women in certain circumstances. They frame this as extending Christian charity to all God's daughters, while privately acknowledging that their most valuable intelligence often comes from women outside the Christian community who can travel freely between different territories and access information unavailable to their Christian sisters. The document establishes elaborate security protocols disguised as spiritual practices. Regular gatherings are described as religious retreats, coded messages as devotional poetry, and intelligence reports as descriptions of religious visions or charitable activities in distant regions. They create a system of safe houses using monasteries and convents whose abbesses have joined their alliance, establishing procedures for providing sanctuary to members fleeing persecution or seeking temporary refuge during dangerous situations. Perhaps most remarkably, the Charter includes provisions for what they call works of mercy, activities that modern observers would recognize as early human rights advocacy. They commit to investigating mistreatment of women in various regions, coordinating pressure against particularly abusive rulers, and supporting legal reforms that would improve women's position in society. They even establish procedures for documenting injustices, creating what amounts to an international court system for addressing grievances that have no remedy in existing legal frameworks. As you watch the scribes complete their work, adding elaborate illuminations that further disguise the document's true nature, you realize they've created something unprecedented in medieval history, a charter that establishes women as independent political actors with rights and obligations that transcend traditional hierarchies. The finished document will be copied and distributed to key abbeys across Europe, creating a network of agreements that exists entirely outside official recognition, but nonetheless establishes binding obligations between women who have never met face to face. The charter they've created represents more than just organizational bylaws. It's a revolutionary document that reimagines the entire structure of medieval society by creating space for female agency and authority. As Eleanor of Aquitaine carefully seals the original document, you understand that these women have just written themselves into history as political actors rather than passive victims of circumstance. 3 years after the Charter's completion, you stand in the rose garden of the castle of Loches, watching as what appears to be a casual conversation between two noble women revolutionizes the medieval institution of marriage. Lady Eleanor de Montfort, barely 18 and officially betrothed to a Flemish count she's never met, speaks in hushed tones with her cousin, who has just returned from a pilgrimage that was actually a fact-finding mission about her intended husband's character and household management. The intelligence she's gathered through the Alliance network paints a troubling picture that will completely alter the course of this diplomatic marriage. The transformation of arranged marriages from powerless pawns to strategic partnerships represents one of the Alliance's most significant early achievements. You observe how their network has systematically begun gathering detailed information about potential husbands, creating what amounts to medieval background checks that cover everything from financial stability to personal temperament. When Lord Geoffrey de Montfort proposed his daughter's marriage to Count Baldwin of Flanders, he imagined a straightforward political alliance that would strengthen trade relationships between their territories. He never suspected that his daughter would have access to detailed reports about Baldwin's treatment of servants, his drinking habits, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding his first wife's death. The Alliance's marriage intelligence network operates through multiple channels that exploit medieval society's blind spots about women's activities. Merchant wives travelling trade routes gather information about noble households they encounter, noting which lords treat their wives with respect and which prefer younger mistresses to their legitimate spouses. Abbesses maintain correspondence with convents near major castles, receiving regular reports about the domestic situations of various noble families. Even servants and wet nurses contribute intelligence. Knowing that the Alliance sometimes provides alternative employment for women fleeing abusive households, you watch as Lady Alienor processes the disturbing information about her intended husband, reports of violent outbursts, financial instability, and 2 previous betrothed women who mysteriously withdrew from their engagements. Armed with this knowledge, she begins implementing the Alliance's sophisticated strategies for negotiating better marriage terms or, if necessary, escaping unwanted matches altogether. The first step involves enlisting her female relatives and trusted servants to create subtle pressure for renegotiating the betrothal contract. The Alliance has developed remarkably effective techniques for influencing marriage negotiations without appearing to challenge male authority directly. Lady Alianor's aunt, herself an Alliance member, begins expressing concerns about the spiritual compatibility of the match, citing troubling dreams that suggest divine disapproval. Her grandmother suddenly develops health problems that require Alianor's constant attendance, making immediate departure for Flanders impossible. Meanwhile, Alliance members in Flemish territories begin spreading carefully crafted rumours about Count Baldwin's financial difficulties, making him appear less attractive to other potential fathers-in-law. Historians still argue whether these early interventions represent genuine concern for individual welfare or calculated political manoeuvring, but surviving letters suggest the Alliance genuinely prioritised protecting young women from abusive situations. Their marriage reform efforts reflect a sophisticated understanding of how personal relationships intersect with broader political dynamics. Recognising that unhappy marriages often destabilise regional peace and create opportunities for enemies to exploit domestic discord, the Alliance's most audacious marriage intervention involves what they term strategic redirection, systematically undermining unwanted matches while simultaneously promoting alternatives that better serve their members' interests. You observe how this process unfolds as Alliance members work to redirect Lady Alianor's marriage prospects toward a young Norman lord whose household has been thoroughly investigated and approved. They orchestrate seemingly coincidental meetings between the families, ensure that favourable reports about the Norman lord reach Lady Alianor's father through trusted intermediaries, and even arrange for financial incentives that make the alternative match more attractive than the original Flemish proposal. The economic aspects of their marriage reforms demonstrate remarkable sophistication in understanding medieval property law and inheritance customs. Alliance members have begun coordinating dowry negotiations to ensure that married women retain some control over their financial resources, often by structuring settlements to include property that reverts to the bride's family under certain circumstances. They've developed template marriage contracts that include provisions for widows' rights, protection against domestic violence, and even grounds for annulment that go beyond the Church's limited recognition of abusive situations. One of their most revolutionary innovations involves what they privately call cooperative marriages, arranged matches between Alliance members' children that are explicitly designed to create partnerships rather than traditional subordinate relationships. You witness negotiations for such a marriage between the daughter of a Burgundian countess and the son of a Bavarian merchant family, where both sets of parents are Alliance members who prioritise creating a union that will strengthen their network while ensuring both parties' happiness and autonomy. These cooperative marriages include unprecedented provisions for shared decision-making, equal access to education for children regardless of gender, and explicit protections for the wife's continued participation in alliance activities, the contracts even address potential conflicts between spousal obligations and alliance loyalty, establishing procedures for mediation and compromise that prioritize the well-being of all parties involved. Medieval canon lawyers would be horrified by these arrangements, but their careful legal language makes them difficult to challenge through conventional channels. The Alliance's marriage reforms extend beyond individual cases to systematic efforts at changing cultural attitudes about women's roles in matrimony. Alliance members begin hosting gatherings where young women can meet potential husbands in supervised social settings, creating opportunities for personal compatibility to influence matchmaking rather than leaving everything to parental arrangement. They establish schools where girls learn not only traditional domestic skills, but also basic legal knowledge, accounting, and negotiation techniques that will help them protect their interests within marriage. You observe how the Alliance addresses the particular challenges facing women who inherit significant property or titles in their own right. These heiresses face enormous pressure to marry quickly and surrender control to husbands who can defend their territories militarily. But Alliance members have developed strategies for protecting their autonomy. They create networks of female vassals and trusted administrators who can manage properties during transitions, establish legal frameworks for marriages that preserve women's authority over their inherited lands, and even coordinate military support from other Alliance members when heiresses face hostile takeover attempts. The religious dimensions of their marriage reforms prove particularly delicate, since church doctrine emphasizes wifely obedience and male authority within matrimony. Alliance members work carefully within theological frameworks, arguing that happier marriages produce more virtuous Christian households and that protecting women from abuse serves God's purposes. They support female religious leaders who emphasize biblical passages about mutual love and respect between spouses, gradually building theological justification for more egalitarian marriage relationships. As you witness Lady Aelinor's successful escape from her unwanted Flemish marriage and subsequent betrothal to the carefully vetted Norman lord, you realize that the Alliance has fundamentally altered the dynamics of medieval diplomacy. Marriage negotiations that once involved only men discussing women as property now must account for the women's own intelligence networks, preferences, and ability to influence outcomes through seemingly invisible channels. But perhaps most significantly, you understand that these marriage reforms represent the Alliance's first systematic challenge to the fundamental power structures of medieval society, proving that women could coordinate effectively to protect their interests and gradually reshape institutions that had previously seemed unchangeable. By 1158, you find yourself following a seemingly innocent-looking merchant caravan along the dusty roads between Paris and Reims, but the cargo these traders carry extends far beyond bolts of silk and bags of spices. Hidden within the false bottoms of their wagons lies the most sophisticated intelligence network medieval Europe has ever seen. Operated entirely by women who have transformed routine domestic activities into an information highway that spans continents. The irony that medieval society's dismissal of women's intellectual capabilities has created its greatest blind spot isn't lost on the Alliance members who exploit this advantage with increasing sophistication. The network operates through layers of seemingly innocent activities that exploit every avenue available to medieval women. You observe how the daily rhythm of monastic life provides perfect cover for intelligence operations. The canonical hours that regulate prayer schedules also create predictable windows for secure communications, while the constant flow of pilgrims and visitors to religious houses allows messages to travel without arousing suspicion. When the bells ring for matins, Alliance members know that coded messages left in predetermined locations will be collected and forwarded during the confusion of morning prayers. Religious festivals and holy days serve as crucial coordination points for the network. You watch as thousands of pilgrims converge on Canterbury Cathedral for the feast of St. Thomas Becket. But hidden among the genuinely devout worshippers are alliance operatives using the crowds to exchange intelligence about political developments across England and continental Europe. A woman kneeling in apparent prayer beside Becket's tomb might actually be receiving detailed reports about King Henry II's military preparations for his next continental campaign. While another pilgrim lighting candles seems to be transmitting information about grain stockpiles and economic conditions in various English shires, the Alliance has developed an elaborate system of coded communications that appears entirely innocent to casual observers. Recipe exchanges between noble households actually contain detailed intelligence reports, with ingredients representing different types of information and cooking instructions providing analysis and recommendations. A recipe for preserving pears might actually be reporting the preservation of peace treaties, while instructions for preparing roasted fowl could contain military intelligence about troop movements and fortification improvements. The beauty of this system lies in how completely it exploits medieval assumptions about women's interests. No male authority figure would ever suspect that discussions of kitchen management contain sophisticated political analysis. Textile production provides another crucial avenue for intelligence operations. You observe how the Alliance has infiltrated the growing European cloth trade, placing operatives in key positions from sheep farms to finished goods markets. When Flemish weavers discuss thread quality with Italian silk merchants, they're actually exchanging information about the political stability of various regions and the reliability of different trade routes. The technical language of textile production proves remarkably adaptable to intelligence work. Discussions of dye lots can indicate the strength of various political factions, while complaints about thread breakage might warn of upcoming conflicts that could disrupt commerce. The network's most ingenious innovation involves exploiting the medieval practice of women visiting each other for extended periods during pregnancies, illnesses, and family celebrations. These visits, which can last for weeks or months, provide perfect opportunities for thorough intelligence briefings and strategic planning sessions. You watch as Lady Mathilde of Anjou arrives at her sister's castle supposedly to assist with a difficult pregnancy, but her real mission involves coordinating alliance responses to growing tensions between the English and French courts. Her medical supplies include not only herbal remedies, but also coded letters, small valuables for bribing informants, and detailed maps of strategic locations along the Norman-French border. Marriage celebrations become elaborate intelligence conventions where alliance members gather under perfect social cover. You observe how a wedding feast at the court of Champagne transforms into an informal summit meeting, with women using traditional female spaces like the bride's chambers and ladies' solas for sensitive discussions. The week-long celebration provides ample opportunity for detailed briefings about political developments across Europe, coordination of future operations, and recruitment of new members from among the guests. Even the wedding gifts serve dual purposes. An ornate jewellery box might contain hidden compartments for storing sensitive documents, while embroidered tapestries could include coded messages woven into their decorative patterns. The Alliance's intelligence network particularly excels at gathering economic information that proves crucial for political analysis. Historians still argue whether their focus on trade and financial intelligence represents genuine understanding of economics, or simply reflects women's traditional involvement in household management. But their success suggests sophisticated comprehension of how money and politics intersect. Alliance members track grain prices, monitor currency fluctuations, and analyze trade disruptions to predict political instability, often months before male rulers recognize developing problems. You witness how this economic intelligence proves its value during the succession crisis that follows the death of the Count of Toulouse. While male nobles focus on military preparations and legal arguments about inheritance rights, Alliance members have already identified the crucial factor that will determine the outcome: control of the salt trade routes that fund the region's economy. Their intelligence network reveals which candidate has secured agreements with key merchants, which trade guilds support different claimants, and most importantly, which financial backers are prepared to fund extended military campaigns. Armed with this information, Alliance members can predict the conflict's outcome and position themselves advantageously before the fighting even begins. The network's medical intelligence operations demonstrate remarkable innovation in exploiting another area where women's expertise is recognized and valued. Alliance members who serve as healers, midwives, and herbalists naturally travel between different households and communities, providing perfect opportunities for gathering information while performing genuinely useful services. You observe how a skilled midwife attending noble births gains access to extremely sensitive family information, succession plans, inheritance disputes, health problems that could affect political stability, and intimate details about relationships between family members that might influence future alliances. These medical operatives prove particularly valuable for gathering intelligence about potential military campaigns, since they often treat injuries and illnesses that reveal training activities, troop movements, and strategic preparations. A healer summoned to treat unusual numbers of sword wounds might deduce that a local lord is intensifying military training, while requests for specific herbal remedies could indicate preparations for siege warfare or extended campaigns in particular geographic regions. The Alliance's most audacious intelligence operations involve infiltrating male-dominated spaces through servants and attendants who remain invisible to the powerful men they serve. You watch as chambermaids, seamstresses, and kitchen workers gather extraordinarily detailed information about private conversations, confidential documents, and secret meetings. These women, often overlooked entirely by their male employers, prove remarkably skilled at observing and remembering crucial details that they report through the Alliance network. A servant who changes bed linens might notice maps left on writing tables, while a woman serving wine during private dinners could overhear strategic discussions that shape international politics. The network even extends into the highest levels of the church hierarchy, through nuns who serve as administrators and advisors to bishops and abbots. These religious women often handle correspondence, manage finances, and participate in administrative meetings where they gather intelligence about church politics, diplomatic negotiations, and religious disputes that intersect with secular power struggles. Their religious status provides additional protection for their activities, since questioning a nun's motives or demanding to inspect her correspondence risks accusations of irreverence or even heresy. As you follow the merchant caravan to its destination, watching as seemingly innocent goods are distributed to Alliance members throughout the region, you realize that this underground information highway has become the medieval world's most efficient intelligence system. The network that began as informal correspondence between isolated women has evolved into a sophisticated operation that often knows about political developments before the rulers themselves understand their full implications. As 1162 dawns across Europe, you find yourself in the counting house of a Venetian merchant family, watching as Lady Isabella Contarini examines ledgers that tell a story far more complex than simple commercial transactions. The columns of figures recording silk shipments and spice imports actually document the Alliance's growing influence over medieval Europe's economic networks, transforming women from passive recipients of male financial decisions into active manipulators of the trade relationships that determine kingdoms' prosperity. The soft scratch of her calculating stylus against wax tablets masks the sound of economic revolution in progress. The Alliance's economic power has grown organically from their members' traditional roles in household management and textile production. But their coordinated approach has created influence that extends far beyond individual family finances. You observe how Lady Isabella coordinates with alliance members across the Mediterranean, synchronizing purchases and sales to influence market prices in ways that serve their broader political objectives. When the Byzantine emperor threatens the interests of alliance members in Constantinople, Venetian traders loyal to the network mysteriously reduce their purchases of Eastern silks, creating economic pressure that often proves more effective than diplomatic protests. The wool trade provides the alliance's most systematic demonstration of economic coordination. English sheep farming, Flemish weaving, and Italian finishing represent different stages in a production chain that alliance members have learned to influence at every level. You watch as Lady Margaret of Norfolk coordinates with Flemish countesses and Lombard merchants to manipulate wool prices in response to political developments. When King Henry II imposes new taxes that burden alliance members unfairly, wool shipments to Flemish territories mysteriously experience delays, quality problems, and pricing disputes that create economic headaches for royal administrators who can never quite identify the source of their troubles. The alliance's most ingenious economic innovation involves what they privately call wealth circulation, systematic efforts to ensure that money flows toward alliance members and away from their enemies. This operates through coordinated purchasing decisions, strategic loans, and carefully timed investments that gradually concentrate economic resources in friendly hands. You observe how alliance members prioritize buying goods from each other's territories, provide favorable credit terms for approved merchants, and coordinate boycotts of regions whose rulers prove particularly hostile to women's interests. Banking operations reveal the alliance's sophisticated understanding of medieval finance. Since women officially cannot engage in many commercial activities, they've developed elaborate systems for operating through male relatives, trusted servants, and allied merchants who serve as their public representatives. Lady Isabella maintains separate account books that track the real ownership and control of various business ventures, revealing a financial network that spans from England to the Holy Land and operates with remarkable coordination despite the apparent independence of its various components. The alliance has proven particularly effective at manipulating currency exchanges and international payments, exploiting their members' positions in trading families to influence the flow of silver and gold across political boundaries. You watch as they coordinate currency speculation that can destabilize hostile rulers' treasuries or provide crucial financial support for friendly regimes. When the Holy Roman Emperor threatens alliance interests in German territories, mysterious fluctuations in silver prices make his military preparations prohibitively expensive, while simultaneous improvements in credit availability for his rivals shift the balance of economic power in ways that even experienced royal treasurers struggle to understand. Agricultural markets provide another arena where the alliance exercises increasing influence. Their members include powerful landowners who control significant grain production, estate managers who oversee vast agricultural holdings, and abbesses whose monasteries operate some of Europe's most productive farms. Historians still argue whether their agricultural coordination represents genuine economic planning or simply reflects women's traditional involvement in household provisioning. But their ability to influence food prices and availability gives them leverage over rulers who depend on stable agricultural markets to maintain social order. You observe how the alliance responds to famine conditions in northern France by coordinating grain shipments from their members' estates in more prosperous regions. But their charity comes with subtle political conditions. Cities that receive alliance assistance find themselves more receptive to policies that benefit women's rights and interests, while regions that have opposed alliance members discover that relief supplies are mysteriously delayed or diverted to more grateful recipients. This agricultural diplomacy proves remarkably effective at building political influence in areas where traditional military or diplomatic pressure would be impossible for women to exercise. The luxury goods trade offers particularly lucrative opportunities for alliance economic operations. Wealthy women have always purchased jewellery, fine textiles, spices, and exotic imports. But the alliance has transformed individual consumption into coordinated market manipulation. When they collectively decide to favour certain suppliers or boycott particular regions, their purchasing power can make or break commercial enterprises. You watch as Parisian goldsmiths compete desperately for alliance approval, knowing that a recommendation from Lady Eleanor or her associates can ensure prosperity. While disapproval can lead to financial ruin, maritime commerce represents one of the alliance's most ambitious economic ventures. Several members have invested in shipping enterprises, using their wealth and connections to fund trading voyages that serve both commercial and intelligence purposes. Alliance-sponsored ships carry more than just merchandise. They transport messages between distant network members, provide secure transportation for women fleeing persecution, and gather commercial intelligence that helps coordinate economic strategies across vast distances. These maritime investments have proven remarkably profitable, generating wealth that funds expanded alliance operations while creating legitimate business enterprises that provide cover for their more sensitive activities. The alliance's approach to craft production demonstrates sophisticated understanding of supply chain management and quality control. They've begun coordinating standards between different regions, ensuring that textiles produced in Flanders meet specifications demanded by Italian markets, while Spanish leather goods satisfy the requirements of Northern European customers. This standardization creates economic efficiencies that benefit all participants, while building trade relationships that strengthen alliance political influence. Manufacturing operations provide opportunities for the alliance to influence local employment and economic development. You observe how alliance members strategically locate new workshops and expand existing operations to support communities that treat women favourably, while withdrawing economic activity from regions where local authorities prove hostile to their interests. A decision to establish a new silk weaving operation can transform a small town's prosperity, creating loyalty and political influence that extends far beyond the immediate economic benefits. The alliance has even begun experimenting with what modern economists would recognize as primitive forms of insurance and banking services. They provide emergency loans to members facing financial crises, coordinate investments that spread risks across multiple ventures, and maintain reserve funds that can support political activities or provide refuge for persecuted members. These financial services create additional bonds between alliance members while generating resources that fund continued expansion of their influence. Perhaps most remarkably, the alliance has begun to influence monetary policy itself through their members' relationships with mints, treasuries, and financial administrators. Several alliance members serve as advisors to rulers on economic matters, positions that medieval society considers appropriate for intelligent women since financial management resembles household administration. You watch as these advisors subtly steer policy decisions in directions that benefit alliance interests, manipulating everything from tax collection to currency debasement in ways that strengthen their network's economic position. As Lady Isabella completes her evening's calculations, carefully encoding the real significance of various transactions in her private ledgers, you realize that the alliance has achieved something unprecedented in medieval history: the creation of an international economic network operated by and for women, capable of influencing political developments through financial pressure rather than military force. Their economic power has become the foundation for everything else they hope to accomplish, transforming them from supplicants seeking male protection into independent actors capable of shaping the very societies that officially deny their existence. The autumn of 1165 brings an unprecedented confrontation that echoes through the stone corridors of Canterbury Cathedral. where you witness Archbishop Thomas Becket facing an opponent he never expected, not King Henry II, but a delegation of Alliance abbesses who challenge his authority over female religious communities with theological arguments he cannot easily dismiss. The meeting, officially recorded as a routine discussion of monastic reforms, actually represents the Alliance's most direct challenge to church hierarchy, as they systematically argue for expanded female participation in religious governance, using the clergy's own scriptural interpretations against them. You observe from the shadows as Abbess Heloise leads a delegation that includes the most formidable religious scholars in medieval Europe. Women whose theological expertise rivals that of any male cleric, but who have been denied formal recognition of their authority. Their strategy demonstrates sophisticated understanding of canonical law and church politics, carefully framing their demands in language that makes opposition appear to contradict established Christian doctrine, rather than challenge legitimate authority structures. The Alliance's religious campaign began years earlier with seemingly innocent scholarly activities that gradually revealed the depth of female theological expertise. Alliance members have been systematically collecting and preserving religious texts that emphasize women's spiritual authority, particularly works by the Desert Mothers and early Christian female saints, whose writings male scholars often ignore or minimize. You watch as Abbess Heloise presents Archbishop Becket with a manuscript containing previously unknown letters from Saint Catherine of Alexandria, documents that argue for female participation in church governance using reasoning that even conservative theologians find compelling. The most audacious move involves challenging the interpretation of biblical passages that supposedly mandate female subordination in religious matters. The Alliance has recruited several sympathetic male scholars who provide theological cover for their arguments. But the real intellectual work comes from women whose deep study of Scripture has revealed inconsistencies and alternative interpretations that male clergy have traditionally ignored. When Abbess Heloise quotes St. Paul's letters in support of female spiritual leadership, citing passages that contradict more commonly referenced texts about women's silence in churches, Archbishop Becket finds himself forced to engage in genuine theological debate rather than simply asserting traditional authority. Historians still argue whether these women genuinely believe their religious arguments or simply use theological language to advance political goals, but their scholarly preparation suggests sincere intellectual engagement with Christian doctrine. The Alliance has established informal networks of female religious scholars who correspond regularly about theological questions, share interpretations of difficult scriptural passages, and coordinate responses to anti-female religious arguments. These scholarly networks operate parallel to their political and economic activities, creating intellectual foundations for their broader challenges to male authority. The monastic reform movement provides perfect cover for the Alliance's religious ambitions across Europe. Church authorities are implementing new rules for religious communities, creating opportunities for Alliance members to argue that these reforms should include expanded roles for women in religious governance. You observe how they frame their demands as returns to early Christian practices rather than innovations, citing historical precedents for female religious authority that male reformers find difficult to dismiss without appearing to reject authentic Christian traditions. The Alliance's approach to religious authority reveals their sophisticated understanding of medieval power structures. Rather than directly challenging the Pope's ultimate authority or questioning fundamental church doctrines, they focus on practical governance issues where they can demonstrate female competence and argue for efficiency improvements. When they propose that abbesses should have greater authority over mixed religious communities, they support their arguments with detailed evidence of superior administrative performance and financial management in female-governed institutions. Property disputes provide the Alliance with numerous opportunities to challenge church authority over female religious communities. Many convents and abbeys possess extensive lands and economic resources that make them attractive targets for ambitious bishops and abbots who seek to expand their territorial control. You watch as alliance members coordinate legal challenges to these attempted takeovers, using canonical law and royal privileges to defend female religious autonomy while building precedents for broader assertions of women's rights. The alliance has proven particularly effective at exploiting conflicts between secular and religious authorities, positioning themselves as valuable allies for rulers who seek to limit church power over temporal matters. When bishops attempt to interfere with royal appointment of abbesses or taxation of religious properties, alliance members provide legal expertise and political support that help secular authorities resist clerical overreach. These collaborations create opportunities for gradual expansion of female authority within religious institutions, while building political relationships that protect the alliance from church persecution. Educational initiatives represent another front in the alliance's religious campaign. They've begun establishing schools within their religious houses that provide advanced education for girls, including instruction in theology, canon law, and classical languages that traditionally remain restricted to male students. You observe how they justify these educational programs as necessary preparation for religious life, but their graduates often pursue secular careers that require the intellectual skills they've acquired. Several alliance-trained women now serve as scribes, translators, and legal advisors in royal courts, positions that provide additional opportunities for advancing their network's interests. The alliance's most controversial religious innovation involves their relationships with reform movements that challenge established church practices. They've developed connections with groups like the Cathars in southern France and various mystical movements throughout Europe, not necessarily because they share these groups' theological beliefs, but because religious diversity creates opportunities for expanding female spiritual authority. When Orthodox clergy condemn these movements as heretical, alliance members often provide practical support for persecuted religious women while carefully maintaining their own doctrinal orthodoxy. Pilgrimage networks provide crucial infrastructure for the alliance's religious operations. Major pilgrimage routes connect religious houses across Europe, creating legitimate reasons for extensive travel and communication between female religious communities. You watch as alliance members coordinate pilgrimage schedules to ensure regular contact between distant monasteries, use pilgrim hostels as meeting places for sensitive discussions, and even establish new pilgrimage destinations that serve their political and economic interests while providing genuine spiritual benefits for participants. The alliance has also begun influencing the selection of religious art and architecture commissioned by their member institutions, using aesthetic choices to promote theological interpretations that emphasize female spiritual authority. Illuminated manuscripts produced in alliance scriptoriums subtly emphasize images of female saints and biblical women in positions of authority, while new church construction incorporates architectural elements that symbolically represent feminine aspects of divine authority. These artistic innovations gradually shift cultural perceptions about women's spiritual roles without directly challenging official doctrine. Liturgical reforms provide another avenue for advancing the alliance's religious agenda. Several alliance abbesses have introduced modified prayer services that emphasize female saints and biblical women, include additional readings from female religious authors, and incorporate musical compositions that celebrate feminine spiritual virtues. You observe how these liturgical innovations spread between alliance-connected religious houses, creating a distinctly female religious culture that operates within orthodox boundaries while gradually expanding ideas about appropriate female spiritual expression. The medical and charitable activities of alliance religious houses demonstrate practical female competence that strengthens their arguments for expanded authority. Alliance-run hospitals and schools consistently outperform institutions managed by male religious authorities. providing concrete evidence that supports their claims about female administrative capabilities. When Archbishop Becket questions whether women possess sufficient wisdom for religious leadership, Abbess Heloise responds with detailed statistics about patient survival rates, educational outcomes, and financial performance that make her case more effectively than any theological argument. As you witness this unprecedented confrontation between female religious authority and traditional church hierarchy, you realize that the Alliance has fundamentally altered medieval Christianity's gender dynamics. Their systematic challenge to religious male authority creates precedents and intellectual frameworks that will influence debates about women's spiritual roles for centuries to come, proving that even the most conservative medieval institutions can be transformed by determined and well-organized female resistance. The winter of 1168 finds you crouched in the shadows of a war council chamber in the castle of Chinon, witnessing something that would horrify medieval chroniclers if they knew it existed. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine and 3 other alliance members providing detailed strategic advice to King Henry II about his upcoming campaign against rebellious barons in Poitou. But this scene, remarkable as it appears, represents only the visible tip of the Alliance's growing influence over medieval military affairs, as women who supposedly know nothing about warfare demonstrate tactical brilliance that often surpasses their male counterparts. The Alliance's military involvement began with necessity rather than ambition. Women whose husbands died in crusades or regional conflicts found themselves responsible for defending territories with inadequate knowledge of siege warfare. Cavalry tactics, or strategic planning, rather than rely entirely on male advisors whose loyalty might be questionable. These women began sharing military intelligence and coordinating defensive strategies through their existing network. You observe how this practical cooperation gradually evolved into sophisticated understanding of medieval warfare that encompasses everything from castle design to international diplomacy. Lady Ermengarde of Narbonne, whose strategic position between Christian and Islamic territories has made her an expert on military intelligence, quietly briefs Eleanor about Moorish siege techniques that could prove decisive in upcoming campaigns. Her knowledge comes not from theoretical study, but from practical experience defending her own territories against various enemies, supplemented by intelligence gathered through alliance networks that extend into Muslim Spain and the Byzantine Empire. The irony that women excluded from formal military training often possess more current tactical knowledge than male commanders, trained in outdated traditional methods, isn't lost on alliance members who exploit this advantage systematically. The Alliance's approach to military intelligence demonstrates remarkable sophistication in exploiting their members' access to information that male spies couldn't obtain. Women attending social gatherings hear details about troop strengths, supply problems, and morale issues that commanders carefully conceal from ethereal observers. A noblewoman visiting relatives in a supposedly neutral territory can assess defensive preparations, note strategic weaknesses, and evaluate the reliability of local allies through casual conversations that would be impossible for male intelligence agents to conduct without arousing suspicion. You watch as the Alliance coordinates intelligence about the English Barons' rebellion, gathering information through multiple channels that provide far more complete pictures than traditional military reconnaissance. Servants in rebel castles report to Alliance members about food supplies, weapons stockpiles, and internal disagreements among the conspirators. Wives and daughters of rebellious lords, often sympathetic to Alliance goals, provide details about military plans, financial resources, and potential weak points in rebel alliances. Even prostitutes and tavern keepers in garrison towns contribute intelligence about soldier morale, pay problems, and desertion rates that help Alliance strategists predict enemy capabilities. The Siege of Lusignan provides the Alliance's first major opportunity to demonstrate their military expertise directly, When Geoffrey de Lusignan fortifies his castle against royal forces, Eleanor and her alliance advisors recommend innovative tactics that combine traditional siege warfare with psychological operations designed to exploit known weaknesses in the defender's position. You observe how they coordinate attacks on Lusignan's economic base, systematically disrupting his supply lines through alliance-controlled territories while spreading rumours about his financial problems that undermine support among his own vassals. Historians still argue whether women's supposedly natural inclination toward negotiation and compromise makes them more effective military strategists, or whether their exclusion from traditional military culture simply allows them to think more creatively about tactical problems. The alliance's success suggests that their different perspective on warfare, emphasizing intelligence, logistics, and psychological factors rather than focusing primarily on direct combat, often produces better results than conventional military approaches. The alliance has proven particularly effective at coordinating defensive strategies for members whose territories face military threats. They've developed standardized procedures for rapid communication about enemy movements, mutual assistance agreements for providing military support across political boundaries, and coordinated strategies for making attacking forces face multiple simultaneous problems. When hostile forces threaten one alliance member's territory, neighbouring allies create diversions, supply problems, and intelligence leaks that force enemies to divide their attention and resources. Supply line management represents another area where the alliance's military expertise exceeds that of many traditional commanders. Their economic networks provide detailed knowledge about regional resources, transportation capabilities, and logistical bottlenecks that often determine campaign outcomes more than battlefield tactics. You watch as alliance strategists plan campaigns around careful analysis of seasonal weather patterns, harvest schedules, and trade route availability, ensuring that friendly forces maintain adequate supplies while enemy logistics face systematic disruption. The alliance's approach to fortress design and siege defense reflects their practical understanding of how attacks actually develop, rather than theoretical knowledge of military engineering. Several alliance members have overseen castle construction or renovation projects, incorporating defensive innovations that address real tactical problems they've observed during actual sieges. Their fortifications emphasize multiple escape routes, hidden communication systems, and concealed supply caches that reflect women's particular concerns about protecting non-combatants during military conflicts. Naval warfare presents unique opportunities for alliance military involvement. Since medieval naval operations often depend more on logistics and intelligence than traditional combat skills, alliance members with connections to maritime trading networks provide crucial intelligence about enemy shipping, coordinate attacks on hostile commerce, and organize supply operations for friendly naval forces. You observe how their detailed knowledge of seasonal weather patterns, port facilities, and sailing schedules often proves more valuable than conventional naval tactics in determining the outcomes of maritime campaigns. The alliance has also begun influencing military recruitment and training, using their economic networks to direct skilled craftsmen, experienced soldiers, and military engineers toward friendly commanders while creating labour shortages that handicap hostile forces. Their ability to influence local employment markets allows them to ensure that Allied armies have access to superior equipment, experienced personnel, and adequate support services, while enemy forces struggle with recruitment problems and supply shortages that gradually erode their military effectiveness. Diplomatic negotiations represent perhaps the alliance's most sophisticated military contribution, as they coordinate peace talks, prisoner exchanges, and truce agreements that serve broader strategic objectives rather than simply ending immediate conflicts. You watch as Eleanor and her alliance colleagues manage complex negotiations that resolve the Poitou rebellion through carefully structured agreements that appear to restore royal authority while actually strengthening alliance influence over regional politics. The psychological aspects of medieval warfare provide another arena where Alliance expertise proves particularly valuable. Their understanding of court politics, family relationships, and personal motivations allows them to predict how various commanders will respond to different tactical situations, identify potential defectors among enemy forces, and design propaganda campaigns that undermine hostile morale while strengthening friendly determination. When they recommend specific psychological pressure tactics against rebellious barons, their suggestions reflect detailed knowledge of individual personalities and family dynamics that male commanders rarely possess. As you observe the successful conclusion of the Poitou campaign, with rebel forces surrendering after a series of coordinated pressures that made continued resistance appear hopeless, you realize that the Alliance has fundamentally altered medieval military affairs. Their systematic application of intelligence, logistics, and psychological warfare has proven that effective military strategy depends more on comprehensive planning and resource management than traditional combat skills, creating new possibilities for female influence over the supposedly masculine domain of warfare. Spring arrives in 1172 with an explosion of artistic creativity that transforms courts across Europe. As you find yourself in the scriptoriums, ateliers, and music halls where Alliance patronage revolutionizes medieval culture, in the scriptorium of Saint-Denis Abbey, you watch as illuminated manuscripts emerge with subtle but unprecedented imagery. Biblical queens depicted wearing crowns of authority rather than submission, female saints shown teaching male disciples, and marginalia filled with symbols that Alliance members recognize as encoded messages celebrating feminine wisdom and power. The cultural renaissance sparked by Alliance patronage operates on multiple levels, transforming not only what art gets created, but how it's interpreted and distributed throughout medieval society. You observe how Lady Marie de Champagne, Eleanor's daughter and a prominent Alliance member, coordinates with scriptoriums across France to commission manuscript copies that emphasize texts celebrating female intelligence and spiritual authority. These aren't random artistic choices, but carefully planned cultural interventions designed to gradually shift societal attitudes about women's capabilities and appropriate roles. Musical innovations prove particularly effective at spreading Alliance influence through medieval courts. The emerging tradition of courtly romance, with its emphasis on idealized relationships between noble ladies and their devoted knights, provides perfect cover for promoting revolutionary ideas about women's intellectual and emotional equality. You listen as troubadours perform songs that appear to celebrate traditional chivalric values but actually contain sophisticated arguments for female autonomy and authority. Lyrics crafted by Alliance poets who understand how to embed radical concepts within seemingly conventional entertainment. The Alliance's most ambitious cultural project involves systematic preservation and dissemination of works by female authors whose writings male scholars often ignore or suppress. They've established copying networks that ensure survival of texts by Hildegard of Bingen, Christine de Pietzen's predecessors, and various anonymous female religious writers whose theological insights challenge conventional interpretations of women's spiritual roles. You watch as Alliance scriptoriums produce multiple copies of these works, distributing them to libraries across Europe where they gradually influence scholarly discussions and educational curricula. Literary patronage allows the Alliance to influence the development of vernacular languages and regional literature in ways that promote their broader political objectives. They commission chronicles that emphasize female rulers' achievements, support poets who celebrate women's intellectual contributions to courtly culture, and fund translation projects that make classical texts celebrating feminine wisdom available to broader audiences. These literary investments create cultural foundations for their political activities while providing entertainment that makes Alliance gatherings appear to focus on artistic rather than subversive pursuits. Visual arts provide particularly effective vehicles for Alliance cultural influence because medieval audiences interpret artistic symbolism in ways that allow multiple levels of meaning to coexist within single works. You observe how Alliance commissioned tapestries, church decorations, and jewellery incorporate imagery that celebrates feminine authority while maintaining plausible religious or mythological interpretations that deflect potential criticism. A tapestry depicting the Queen of Sheba visiting Solomon might appear to illustrate biblical wisdom, but Alliance members recognize it as celebrating female intellectual equality with male authorities. The Alliance has proven remarkably effective at influencing architectural projects, using their wealth and political connections to shape the design of churches, castles, and public buildings in ways that subtly promote feminine spiritual and temporal authority. You watch as Alliance members work with architects and master builders to incorporate decorative elements that emphasize female saints, biblical women in positions of authority, and classical goddesses associated with wisdom and justice. These architectural choices gradually normalize images of female power within medieval visual culture. Historians still argue whether the Alliance's cultural activities represent genuine artistic patronage or calculated propaganda campaigns, but their systematic approach suggests sophisticated understanding of how cultural change influences political possibilities. They recognize that shifting artistic representations of women can gradually alter social expectations about female capabilities, creating cultural foundations that support their broader political objectives while providing plausible justification for their own unconventional activities. Educational initiatives represent another crucial aspect of the Alliance's cultural program. They've begun establishing schools that provide advanced education for girls, including instruction in classical languages, mathematics, and natural philosophy that traditionally remains restricted to male students. You observe how these educational programs operate under religious auspices that deflect potential criticism while producing graduates who possess intellectual skills that enable them to participate more effectively in political and economic activities. The medical and scientific traditions maintained by Alliance members contribute significantly to medieval intellectual development, particularly in areas where female expertise has always been recognized. Alliance-supported scholars preserve and expand knowledge of herbal medicine, surgical techniques, and natural philosophy, often incorporating learning from Islamic and Byzantine sources that male Christian scholars reject for religious reasons. Their medical schools and hospitals become centers of innovation that demonstrate female intellectual capabilities while providing practical services that strengthen Alliance political influence. Philosophical discussions within Alliance circles address fundamental questions about the nature of authority, the relationship between temporal and spiritual power, and the proper organization of society that wouldn't be formally explored by male political theorists for centuries. You listen as Alliance members debate questions about natural law, divine authority, and social contracts using intellectual frameworks that challenge basic assumptions of medieval political thought. These philosophical explorations provide theoretical foundations for their practical political activities while creating intellectual traditions that influence broader cultural development. The Alliance's approach to religious music and liturgical arts demonstrates their sophisticated understanding of how aesthetic experiences shape spiritual and political attitudes. They commission masses, motets, and hymns that emphasize feminine aspects of divine authority, support composers who create musical settings for texts celebrating female saints and biblical women, and establish musical traditions within their religious houses that gradually influence broader liturgical practices. You watch as Alliance-sponsored musical innovations spread between religious communities, creating distinctly feminine religious cultures that operate within orthodox boundaries while expanding ideas about appropriate female spiritual expression. Textile arts provide particularly effective vehicles for Alliance cultural influence because medieval society expects women to excel in embroidery, weaving, and fabric decoration. The Alliance has transformed these traditional feminine crafts into sophisticated communication networks that spread political messages, preserve historical information, and demonstrate female artistic capabilities. You observe how Alliance-produced textiles incorporate complex symbolic systems that convey detailed information about political developments, military intelligence, and economic conditions while appearing to focus entirely on decorative beauty. The international scope of Alliance cultural activities creates unprecedented opportunities for cross-cultural exchange and artistic innovation. Alliance members facilitate contact between artists, scholars, and craftsmen from different regions, supporting creative collaborations that produce new artistic styles and intellectual syntheses. You watch as Islamic geometric patterns influence European decorative arts through Alliance connections, while Byzantine manuscript illumination techniques spread to Western scriptoriums through Alliance-sponsored cultural exchanges. Performance traditions provide another avenue for Alliance cultural influence, as they support travelling entertainers, theatrical productions, and storytelling traditions that carry Alliance messages to audiences throughout Europe. Court entertainment sponsored by Alliance members often includes subtle political commentary, educational content about female historical figures, and moral instruction that challenges conventional ideas about appropriate gender roles. These performance traditions prove particularly effective at reaching audiences who cannot read, extending Alliance cultural influence beyond literate elites to broader medieval society, as you witness the completion of a magnificent illuminated psalter commissioned by Alliance members, its pages filled with images of wise queens, learned abbesses, and victorious female saints. You realize that the Alliance has achieved something unprecedented in medieval history: the systematic transformation of the European cultural production to support revolutionary ideas about women's intellectual capabilities and political rights. Their cultural renaissance creates aesthetic and intellectual foundations that will support their political activities for generations, while demonstrating that even the most traditional aspects of medieval society can be transformed by determined and well-organized female resistance. The year 1176 brings momentous change as you find yourself in the Hall of Justice at Poitiers, where something unprecedented in medieval legal history unfolds before your eyes. Eleanor of Aquitaine presides over a court session where Alliance legal scholars present arguments for revolutionary reforms to inheritance law, marriage customs, and property rights that would fundamentally alter the legal status of women throughout Europe. The proceeding appears to address routine administrative matters, but the legal precedents being established will echo through centuries of jurisprudence. As women who supposedly possess no legal expertise demonstrate mastery of canon law, Roman legal traditions, and Germanic customs that surpasses many trained male jurists, the Alliance's legal reform movement began with practical necessity: women inheriting property, managing estates during their husbands' absences, and defending their children's interests, discovered that existing laws provided inadequate protection for their legitimate concerns. Rather than simply accepting these limitations, Alliance members began systematic study of legal traditions, identifying inconsistencies, precedents, and alternative interpretations that could support expanded female rights. You observe how their legal scholarship reveals remarkable sophistication in understanding how different legal systems interact and how strategic litigation can gradually transform established practices. Their most ambitious legal innovation involves coordinated challenges to inheritance laws that systematically disadvantage female heirs. The Alliance has identified numerous cases where women's inheritance rights conflict with traditional male primogeniture, creating opportunities to argue for alternative legal interpretations that would recognize female claims to family property. You watch as alliance legal scholars present carefully researched arguments based on Roman law precedents, Germanic tribal customs, and canon law principles that support female inheritance rights in specific circumstances, gradually building case law that could eventually challenge fundamental assumptions about property transmission. Marriage law provides another crucial arena for alliance legal reform efforts. They've begun coordinating challenges to forced marriages, advocating for expanded grounds for annulment, and arguing for legal protections against domestic violence that go beyond existing church regulations. Their approach demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how civil and canon law interact, exploiting jurisdictional conflicts between secular and religious authorities to create opportunities for advancing women's legal interests. When bishops and royal courts disagree about marriage law interpretation, alliance legal scholars often provide the expertise that influences final decisions. Property rights represent perhaps the most complex area of alliance legal reform. Since medieval law regarding female property ownership varies dramatically between different regions and legal traditions, the Alliance has begun systematic documentation of these variations, identifying jurisdictions where women enjoy greater legal protections and developing strategies for extending these protections to other regions. You observe how they coordinate test cases that establish precedents for female property rights, carefully selecting situations where existing legal principles support their arguments while avoiding challenges that might provoke backlash against broader reform efforts. The Alliance's approach to commercial law reflects their growing economic influence and sophisticated understanding of medieval business practices. They've identified numerous areas where existing laws fail to account for women's actual participation in commercial activities, creating opportunities to argue for legal recognition of female business competence. When Alliance members engage in trading activities, lending operations, or manufacturing enterprises, they carefully document their successes to demonstrate that legal restrictions on female commercial participation lack practical justification. Historians still argue whether the Alliance's legal reforms represent genuine concern for justice or calculated efforts to advance their own political interests. But the systematic approach suggests both motivations operate simultaneously. They recognize that expanding legal protections for women generally will strengthen their own position while serving broader humanitarian objectives, creating alignment between self-interest and social reform that strengthens their reform efforts. Legal education represents another crucial component of the Alliance's reform strategy. They've begun training women in legal principles, court procedures, and advocacy techniques that enable them to defend their own interests and assist other women facing legal challenges. You watch as Alliance legal scholars establish informal schools where women learn to read Latin legal texts, understand court procedures, and present oral arguments that can influence judicial decisions. These educational programs operate discreetly to avoid provoking opposition from male legal authorities who would view formal female legal education as inappropriate and potentially threatening. The Alliance has proven particularly effective at exploiting conflicts between different legal jurisdictions to advance their reform objectives. Medieval Europe's complex legal landscape includes Roman civil law, Germanic tribal customs, canon law, and various local traditions that often contradict each other, creating opportunities for creative legal interpretation. When Alliance members face adverse decisions in one jurisdiction, they often appeal to alternative legal authorities whose different legal traditions may provide more favourable outcomes. Documentary evidence plays a crucial role in Alliance legal strategies as they systematically preserve records that support female legal claims while challenging documentation that appears to restrict women's rights unfairly. You observe how Alliance scriptoriums produce carefully researched legal compilations that present historical precedents for female legal authority, creating scholarly resources that support their litigation efforts while establishing intellectual foundations for broader legal reforms. International legal cooperation represents one of the Alliance's most innovative developments. As they coordinate legal strategies across political boundaries to address similar legal problems in different kingdoms. When Alliance members in England develop successful arguments for female inheritance rights, they share those legal strategies with colleagues in France, Germany, and Italy who face comparable challenges. This legal cooperation creates opportunities for establishing consistent precedents across Europe, while building practical experience in international legal coordination. The Alliance's litigation strategies demonstrate remarkable sophistication in understanding how court procedures and judicial psychology influence legal outcomes. They've learned to present arguments in ways that appeal to judges' existing prejudices while gradually introducing more radical concepts, carefully framing women's rights arguments in language that emphasizes tradition, stability, and religious authority, rather than challenging established social hierarchies directly. Criminal law provides perhaps the most challenging arena for Alliance legal reform. Since medieval criminal procedures generally assume male authority over legal proceedings and offer limited protections for female victims of violence or fraud, the Alliance has begun developing alternative dispute resolution mechanisms that operate parallel to official criminal justice systems, providing practical remedies for women who cannot obtain justice through conventional legal channels, while building precedents for expanded female legal protection. Testamentary law offers significant opportunities for Alliance legal innovation. Since medieval inheritance customs often conflict with written wills that reflect individual intentions rather than traditional family obligations, Alliance legal scholars have become experts in drafting wills that maximize female beneficiaries' rights while minimizing opportunities for male relatives to challenge testamentary provisions through litigation. The Alliance's approach to legal advocacy reflects their understanding that successful reform requires both intellectual excellence and political sophistication. They've learned to present their arguments in ways that emphasize legal precedent and scholarly authority, rather than appearing to challenge fundamental social institutions, gradually building acceptance for expanded female rights without provoking organized opposition from threatened male authorities. As you witness Eleanor of Aquitaine concluding the day's legal proceedings with decisions that establish important precedents for female property rights while appearing to address only routine administrative matters, you realize that the Alliance has achieved something unprecedented in medieval legal history. Their systematic legal reform efforts have begun transforming the fundamental legal status of women throughout Europe, proving that even the most conservative legal institutions can be gradually reformed through determined scholarship, strategic litigation, and careful political coordination. The winter of 1179 arrives with bitter winds that mirror the growing tensions within the Alliance itself. As you witness the first serious fractures in what had seemed an unshakable sisterhood. In the chapter house of Fontevraud Abbey, where the Alliance was born nearly 3 decades earlier, angry voices echo off stone walls as fundamental disagreements about religion, politics, and social reform threaten to tear apart the most successful women's organisation in medieval history. The irony that their very success has created the internal conflicts that now endanger their unity isn't lost on the founding members who watched decades of careful work hanging in the balance. The schism emerges from multiple sources that reflect the Alliance's diverse membership and ambitious scope. You observe how religious differences that were once manageable through careful diplomacy have intensified as church authorities increasingly scrutinize activities that seem suspiciously organized for supposedly independent female religious communities. The more conservative Alliance members, particularly older abbesses from established monasteries, argue for reducing political activities and focusing on conventional religious and charitable works that won't attract unwanted attention from hostile church authorities. But the secular noblewomen who have gained political influence through alliance coordination resist any retreat from their hard-won achievements. Eleanor of Aquitaine leads this faction, arguing that abandoning their political activities would betray alliance members who have risked everything to expand female authority in medieval society. The debate grows heated as speakers on both sides cite examples of recent persecution against women who appeared too knowledgeable about political affairs or too independent in their decision-making. Economic disagreements compound the religious and political tensions, as alliance members discover that their financial interests don't always align despite their shared commitment to advancing women's status. You watch as merchant members complain about alliance activities that disrupt profitable trade relationships, while landed nobility worry that coordination with Jewish and Muslim merchants creates vulnerability to accusations of heresy or treason. The Countess of Flanders threatens to withdraw from alliance commercial cooperation unless other members agree to avoid business relationships that might endanger Flemish trading privileges with English and French royal courts. Regional differences create additional sources of conflict, as alliance members from different areas of Europe face varying levels of political pressure and cultural restrictions. German alliance members report that Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa has begun investigating suspicious correspondence between female religious houses, while Spanish members worry about increasing scrutiny from church authorities concerned about possible connections with Islamic territories. These regional variations in political climate make unified alliance responses increasingly difficult to coordinate. Historians still argue whether the Great Schism represents inevitable tensions within any large organization or reflects specific challenges facing medieval women who attempted to create international political cooperation. The surviving correspondence suggests that alliance members genuinely struggled to balance competing loyalties and interests that became more difficult to reconcile as their organization grew larger and more influential. Generational conflicts add another layer of complexity to the alliance's internal divisions. Founding members who remember the early years of careful secrecy and gradual influence building often clash with younger women who want more aggressive political action and public recognition of their achievements. You observe heated debates between alliance veterans who counsel patience and strategic thinking against newer members who argue that the time has come for open challenges to male authority rather than continued covert operations. The succession crisis in England provides a catalyst that transforms simmering tensions into open conflict. When Henry II's sons rebel against their father's authority, alliance members find themselves supporting different sides in a conflict that divides their loyalties along family, regional, and political lines. Eleanor of Aquitaine's support for her son's rebellion forces other alliance members to choose between loyalty to their organization and obligations to their own feudal lords, creating impossible dilemmas that reveal fundamental contradictions in their earlier unity. Social class differences that the alliance had successfully managed for decades become increasingly problematic as their organization gains influence and visibility. Noble members worry that association with merchant women and reformed prostitutes could damage their reputations and political standing, while non-noble members resent implications that their participation should be limited to avoid embarrassing their social superiors. These class tensions reflect broader medieval social hierarchies that even the alliance's revolutionary goals cannot completely overcome. The debate over alliance membership criteria becomes particularly contentious as different factions propose contradictory solutions to their security and effectiveness challenges. Conservative members argue for restricting membership to women from established Christian families with proven loyalty records, while more radical voices advocate for expanding inclusion to encompass any woman committed to advancing female rights, regardless of her social background or religious affiliation. Theological disputes that had remained dormant during the alliance's early years emerge as increasingly serious sources of division. The growing influence of mystical religious movements, particularly among younger alliance members, creates tensions with more traditional religious authorities within their organisation. You watch as debates about female spiritual authority, the proper interpretation of biblical passages regarding women's roles, and appropriate relationships with heterodox religious movements reveal fundamental disagreements about the alliance's religious identity and mission. The question of alliance response to external threats proves equally divisive. When church authorities begin more systematic investigations of suspicious female religious activities, some alliance members advocate for complete dissolution to protect their members from persecution, while others argue for coordinated resistance that might deter future attacks through demonstrations of organised female power. These strategic disagreements reflect different assessments of political risks and opportunities that create irreconcilable differences about appropriate tactical responses. Intelligence and security concerns add additional stress to alliance relationships, as members discover that their communication networks have been partially compromised by hostile authorities. Accusations of security breaches, debates about communication procedures, and disputes over information sharing create an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust that undermines the personal relationships that had held their organisation together through earlier challenges. Financial pressures created by their expanded activities strain alliance resources and create new sources of conflict between members who contribute different levels of support to their common efforts. The cost of maintaining their intelligence networks, supporting legal challenges, and protecting persecuted members exceeds their original budget estimates, forcing difficult decisions about priorities and resource allocation that reveal disagreements about their organization's fundamental purposes. Personal rivalries that had been suppressed during the alliance's early years of shared struggle emerge as serious obstacles to continued cooperation. Competition for influence within their organization, disputes over credit for their achievements, and conflicts over leadership succession create interpersonal tensions that make effective coordination increasingly difficult. As you witness the Alliance's Winter Assembly concluding without resolving their fundamental disagreements, members departing with barely concealed hostility and uncertain commitments to future cooperation, you realize that success itself has created the internal contradictions that now threaten their survival. The organization that had seemed unshakable during its years of growth and achievement now faces the possibility that its greatest enemy might be its own success in creating opportunities and expectations that exceed any single organization's ability to fulfill. The devastating pestilence arrives in European ports during the autumn of 1347, but for you, witnessing events through the Alliance network, the Black Death represents both catastrophe and opportunity as their sophisticated communication and resource-sharing systems prove far superior to official responses in combating the greatest medical crisis medieval Europe has ever faced. In the infirmaries of Alliance-controlled religious houses, you observe how decades of coordinated medical knowledge and supply networks enable them to maintain higher survival rates than conventional medical authorities, while their pre-existing mutual aid systems provide economic and social support that helps communities survive when traditional institutions collapse. The Alliance's medical preparedness reflects years of investment in healing knowledge and herbal medicine that had initially developed to serve their members' practical needs, but now proves invaluable during a pandemic that kills between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. You watch as Alliance healers implement isolation procedures, maintain detailed records of symptom progression, and coordinate distribution of medicinal supplies using protocols that demonstrate more sophisticated understanding of disease transmission than most university-trained physicians possess. Their response begins even before the plague reaches European shores, as Alliance intelligence networks provide early warning about the devastating mortality rates the disease produces in Constantinople, Islamic territories, and Mediterranean trading cities. While official authorities dismiss initial reports as exaggerated or irrelevant to Christian territories, Alliance members begin stockpiling medical supplies, preparing isolation facilities, and coordinating emergency communication procedures that will prove crucial during the chaos that follows. Sister Marguerite of the Hôtel Dieu in Paris exemplifies the Alliance's medical leadership during the crisis. Her infirmary implements innovative treatment protocols that emphasize patient isolation, careful hygiene, and nutritional support rather than the bloodletting and purgatives favored by male physicians. You observe how her methods, developed through Alliance medical correspondence and practical experimentation, achieve survival rates nearly double those of conventional medical institutions, gradually attracting patients from across the region despite initial skepticism from medical authorities. The Alliance's economic coordination proves equally crucial as traditional trading relationships collapse under the pressure of massive mortality and social disruption. Their pre-existing networks for sharing resources and coordinating assistance enable rapid distribution of food supplies, medicinal herbs, and essential goods to affected regions even when official trade routes fail completely. You watch as Alliance-controlled territories maintain relative stability while nearby regions experience economic collapse. Famine and social upheaval that compound a medical disaster. Historians still argue whether the Alliance's superior pandemic response reflects genuine medical knowledge or simply results from their better organizational systems. But surviving records suggest both factors contribute to their success. Their systematic approach to documenting medical treatments, coordinating supply distribution, and maintaining communication during social chaos demonstrates institutional capabilities that most medieval organizations lack. Religious responses to the plague create both challenges and opportunities for Alliance members as extremist movements blame women, Jews, and various minority groups for supposedly causing God's wrath through their sinful behavior. You observe how Alliance religious authorities counter these accusations by emphasizing charitable works, medical care, and community support that demonstrate Christian virtue while protecting vulnerable populations from scapegoating and violence. The massive mortality rates create unprecedented opportunities for surviving women to inherit property, assume economic responsibilities, and exercise authority that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Alliance members prove remarkably effective at helping widows and female heirs navigate the legal and practical challenges of assuming control over estates, businesses, and other assets that traditional inheritance customs would normally transfer to male relatives. Labor shortages caused by plague mortality enable surviving women to demand better working conditions, higher wages, and greater economic autonomy than previous generations could imagine. Alliance coordination helps women exploit these opportunities systematically, sharing information about regions where labor scarcity creates favorable conditions and providing mutual support for women who relocate to pursue better economic prospects. The plague's impact on religious institutions creates additional opportunities for Alliance advancement as many male religious authorities die while female religious communities, protected by their superior medical knowledge and isolation procedures, maintain higher survival rates. You watch as Alliance-connected abbesses assume responsibility for governing mixed religious communities, managing extensive properties, and providing spiritual leadership in regions where traditional male religious hierarchy has been devastated. Educational initiatives become particularly important during the plague years as traditional schools and universities close, while Alliance-supported educational programs continue operating with modified procedures that protect students and teachers from infection. Their schools, which had already provided advanced education for girls, now serve broader community educational needs while demonstrating female competence in maintaining essential social services during crisis conditions. The Alliance's mutual aid systems prove their value during the plague years as members coordinate assistance for families facing medical crises, economic hardship, and social disruption that overwhelm conventional support networks. You observe how their pre-existing arrangements for emergency loans, temporary refuge, and resource sharing enable Alliance communities to maintain social cohesion while nearby regions experience breakdown of traditional relationships and obligations. International cooperation becomes increasingly important as the plague disrupts political boundaries and traditional diplomatic relationships. Alliance members maintain communication and coordination across regions where official governments have ceased effective functioning, creating informal international relationships that often prove more reliable than formal diplomatic channels during the crisis period. Documentation and record-keeping activities conducted by Alliance scriptoriums preserve crucial information about plague progression, treatment effectiveness, and social responses that would otherwise be lost during the chaos of widespread mortality and institutional collapse. Their systematic approach to recording medical observations, economic conditions, and social developments creates historical records that will influence future medical and political responses to similar crises. The plague's psychological impact on survivors creates opportunities for Alliance members to provide counselling, spiritual guidance, and emotional support that help communities process trauma and rebuild social relationships after experiencing unprecedented mortality. Their emphasis on female spiritual authority and community-based healing proves particularly effective in addressing the psychological wounds left by massive social disruption. Recovery efforts following the plague's initial waves demonstrate the Alliance's institutional strength as their coordinated approach to economic reconstruction. Social reorganization and political stabilization enables Alliance territories to recover more quickly than regions dependent on traditional male-dominated institutions. You watch as Alliance members assume leadership roles in rebuilding communities, restoring trade relationships, and re-establishing social services with innovations that reflect lessons learned during the crisis. Demographic changes caused by plague mortality alter medieval social structures in ways that generally benefit the Alliance's long-term objectives. The massive population loss reduces pressure for agricultural land, creates opportunities for social mobility, and weakens traditional hierarchies that had restricted women's economic and political participation. These demographic shifts provide foundations for expanded female authority that extend well beyond the immediate crisis period. Medical innovations developed during the plague years establish Alliance members as recognized authorities in healing and public health, creating legitimacy for their broader claims about female competence in areas traditionally dominated by male expertise. Their superior medical outcomes provide concrete evidence that supports their arguments for expanded female participation in other professional and political activities. As you witness the Alliance emerging from the plague years with enhanced prestige, expanded resources, and strengthened organizational capabilities, you realize that their response to the Black Death has transformed them from a secret network into a recognized institutional force in medieval society. Their demonstrated competence during the greatest crisis of the medieval period establishes credibility and authority that will support their future political activities, while proving that female organization and leadership can outperform traditional male-dominated institutions during critical challenges. The year 1378 brings ominous signs that the Alliance's decades of careful work face their greatest external threat. As you find yourself in a smoke-filled chamber beneath the Tower of London where King Edward III's advisors plot the systematic destruction of what they finally recognized as an organized challenge to male authority throughout Europe. The conspiracy they're planning represents the culmination of growing awareness among threatened rulers that the remarkable coordination between women across different kingdoms isn't coincidental, but reflects a sophisticated international organization that must be destroyed before it becomes powerful enough to challenge royal authority directly. The royal conspiracy emerges from multiple sources of evidence that gradually convinced skeptical male authorities that their earlier dismissals of female intelligence networks had been dangerously naive. You observe how English royal spies present detailed reports about suspicious correspondence patterns between abbesses, unexplained coordination in marriage negotiations across political boundaries, and economic activities that suggest systematic cooperation rather than individual initiative. When these intelligence reports are combined with similar observations from French, German, and Italian sources, the scope of the alliance's activities becomes undeniable. Sir William de Montfort, Edward's chief intelligence advisor, outlines the threat in terms that would have seemed fantastic just decades earlier but now appear terrifyingly plausible to his audience. The alliance's influence over international trade, their intelligence networks that often surpass official diplomatic channels, and their ability to coordinate political activities across national boundaries represent unprecedented challenges to traditional royal authority. He argues that allowing this organization to continue growing would eventually create an alternative power structure capable of constraining or even overthrowing legitimate monarchical government. The conspiracy's planning reveals sophisticated understanding of how the alliance operates and demonstrates that male authorities have finally learned to take female political organization seriously. Rather than attempting direct military attacks that would fail against an organization with no central headquarters or visible command structure, the conspirators plan systematic campaigns to discredit alliance members, disrupt their communication networks, and eliminate key leaders through legal persecution rather than obvious violence. You watch as the conspirators coordinate their efforts across multiple kingdoms, creating an anti-alliance alliance that mirrors their target's international structure. English agents will focus on disrupting alliance activities in territories under English influence, while French authorities target alliance networks in their regions, and Holy Roman Empire officials coordinate attacks on German and Italian alliance members. This coordinated approach reflects grudging respect for their enemies' organizational sophistication. The religious dimension of the anti-alliance conspiracy proves particularly dangerous because church authorities possess legal and moral authority that can justify persecution of women who appear too independent or knowledgeable about worldly affairs. You observe how the conspirators work with conservative bishops and abbots to develop theological arguments that frame alliance activities as potentially heretical challenges to divinely ordained social hierarchies. Creating religious justification for secular political persecution, financial warfare represents another crucial component of the royal conspiracy, as authorities attempt to disrupt the economic networks that provide foundations for alliance political activities. They plan coordinated attacks on alliance-controlled trading enterprises, systematic audits of suspicious financial transactions, and legal challenges to property rights that could strip alliance members of the economic resources that fund their organization's activities. Legal persecution provides the conspirators with their most sophisticated weapon against alliance members. As they plan to use existing laws about female legal capacity, religious authority, and political participation to make alliance activities technically illegal, even though they had operated within legal boundaries for decades. You watch as royal legal scholars craft interpretations of canon law, feudal obligations, and commercial regulations that would criminalize many alliance activities while maintaining plausible claims about enforcing existing legal standards. The conspiracy's intelligence operations demonstrate how seriously male authorities now take the alliance threat, as they deploy significant resources to infiltrate alliance networks, decode their communication systems, and identify key leaders who can be targeted for elimination. These intelligence efforts reveal that the alliance's security procedures, while sophisticated for their time, contain vulnerabilities that determined enemies can exploit with sufficient resources and coordination. Propaganda campaigns represent another crucial element of the anti-alliance strategy as authorities work to turn public opinion against women who appear suspiciously knowledgeable or independent. You observe how they plan to spread rumours about witchcraft, heresy, and sexual impropriety that would discredit alliance members while making it dangerous for other women to associate with them or support their activities. Historians still argue whether the royal conspiracy represents genuine concern about political stability or simply reflects male authorities' determination to maintain traditional power structures against any challenge. But the detailed planning documents suggest both motivations operate simultaneously. The conspirators genuinely believe that allowing female political organisation to continue developing would destabilise medieval society, while also recognising that alliance success threatens their own personal authority and privileges. The timing of the conspiracy reflects broader political developments that make coordinated action against the alliance both possible and necessary from the conspirators' perspective. The end of major military campaigns in France creates opportunities for redirecting resources toward domestic political concerns, while growing centralization of royal authority provides administrative capabilities needed for systematic persecution of a dispersed international organization. Alliance intelligence networks provide early warning about the developing conspiracy through their connections with servants, scribes, and minor officials who overhear planning discussions or observe suspicious activities. You watch as alliance members begin receiving coded warnings about increased surveillance, planned arrests, and coordinated attacks on their economic interests, creating opportunities for defensive preparations that might minimize the conspiracy's effectiveness. The conspiracy's approach to targeting specific alliance leaders reveals sophisticated understanding of their organization's structure and vulnerabilities. Rather than attempting to eliminate Eleanor of Aquitaine or other highly visible members whose persecution was to create political complications, the conspirators plan to focus on less prominent but crucial figures, whose removal would disrupt alliance operations without generating significant political opposition. Religious persecution provides the conspirators with particularly effective tools because accusations of heresy or inappropriate spiritual authority can justify imprisonment, property confiscation, and even execution while maintaining claims about protecting Orthodox Christianity rather than suppressing political opposition. You observe how they coordinate with church authorities to develop cases against prominent alliance religious leaders that could serve as precedents for broader persecution. The economic dimensions of the persecution campaign demonstrate recognition that destroying the alliance's financial foundations would be more effective than attempting to eliminate individual members. Plans for systematic disruption of alliance trading networks, confiscation of suspicious financial assets, and legal challenges to property ownership reveal understanding that the organization's strength depends more on institutional capabilities than individual leadership. Counterintelligence operations represent perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the royal conspiracy, as authorities attempt to feed false information into alliance networks while preventing their own plans from being discovered. These efforts reveal both respect for alliance intelligence capabilities and recognition that success will require neutralizing their enemies' information advantages. As you witness the final coordination meeting where representatives from multiple kingdoms confirm their commitment to synchronized attacks on alliance networks beginning within months, you realize that the organization that had seemed invulnerable during its years of growth and success now faces the most serious threat in its history. The conspiracy they're confronting represents not just political opposition, but systematic recognition that female political organization poses fundamental challenges to medieval social order that male authorities can no longer ignore or dismiss. Against the backdrop of systematic persecution and coordinated royal attacks, the Alliance's final years become a desperate race to preserve their revolutionary achievements for future generations. as you witness Alliance leaders working feverishly to establish permanent institutions, hidden libraries, and legal precedents that might survive even if their organization doesn't. In the scriptorium of a remote alpine monastery, you observe aging Alliance members creating what they hope will be lasting legacies, carefully disguised schools, documented legal reforms, and encrypted chronicles that future women might discover and use to rebuild what persecution threatens to destroy. The legacy-building efforts reflect Alliance members' sophisticated understanding that their greatest achievements lie not in temporary political influence, but in permanently altering medieval society's assumptions about female capabilities and rights. Lady Eleanor, now in her 70s but still sharp as a blade, coordinates these preservation efforts with the same strategic brilliance that built their organization, recognizing that survival requires transforming their revolutionary network into permanent institutional changes that can function independently of their personal leadership. Educational foundations represent their most ambitious legacy project as Alliance members work to establish schools, libraries, and teaching programs that will continue providing advanced education for girls long after their own generation disappears. You watch as they carefully structure these educational institutions to appear entirely conventional while secretly incorporating curriculum innovations that will produce graduates capable of continuing Alliance work under different names and organizational structures. The Alliance has developed remarkably sophisticated techniques for hiding revolutionary educational content within seemingly orthodox religious and domestic instruction. Students learning traditional feminine skills like embroidery and textile production also receive training in mathematical concepts, logical reasoning, and analytical thinking disguised as pattern recognition and design principles. Girls studying religious texts and devotional practices simultaneously learn to read Latin, understand legal documents, and analyze political situations through supposedly spiritual exercises that actually develop practical intellectual capabilities. Library preservation efforts focus on ensuring survival of texts that document female intellectual achievements, legal precedents supporting women's rights, and historical examples of successful female leadership that could inspire future generations. Alliance scriptoriums work desperately to create multiple copies of crucial documents, hiding them in scattered locations where they might survive even systematic persecution. You observe how they develop elaborate cataloguing systems that will enable future Alliance members to locate these hidden resources while preventing hostile authorities from discovering their existence. Legal legacy projects involve systematic documentation of precedents, court decisions, and contractual innovations that establish foundations for expanded female rights under existing legal systems. Alliance legal scholars create comprehensive compilations of successful arguments, favourable judicial interpretations, and procedural innovations that future women can use to defend their interests even without access to Alliance support networks. These legal resources represent decades of accumulated expertise in manipulating medieval legal systems to serve female interests. The Alliance's economic legacy involves establishing businesses, trade relationships, and financial institutions that will continue providing women with economic independence and influence after their political organization disappears. You watch as they create merchant partnerships, craft guilds, and banking arrangements structured to survive political persecution, while maintaining female economic participation at levels that would have been impossible before Alliance intervention. Architectural legacies prove particularly important because buildings and physical improvements provide permanent evidence of female capabilities that can influence future attitudes about women's intellectual and administrative competence. Alliance-sponsored construction projects, artistic commissions, and infrastructure improvements create lasting monuments to female achievement while demonstrating practical skills that challenge conventional assumptions about appropriate gender roles. Religious institutions receive special attention in Alliance legacy planning because convents and abbeys offer the best opportunities for preserving female educational and cultural achievements within structures that enjoy some protection from secular persecution. You observe how Alliance members work to establish new religious houses, endow existing institutions, and create governance structures that will maintain their educational and cultural innovations even under hostile external conditions. The medical legacy projects focus on preserving Alliance innovations in healing, public health, and medical education that could benefit future generations, while demonstrating female expertise in areas traditionally dominated by male authorities. Alliance medical schools, hospitals, and training programs create institutional foundations for continued female participation in medical fields, while preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost during political upheavals. Historians still argue whether the Alliance's legacy-building efforts represent realistic planning for organizational continuation or desperate attempts to find meaning in inevitable defeat. But the institutional changes they create do survive long after their political network disappears. Their educational innovations, legal precedents, and cultural achievements provide foundations that future women's rights movements will rediscover and build upon centuries later. Cultural preservation efforts involve commissioning artistic works, supporting literary projects, and documenting cultural innovations that celebrate female intellectual achievements while creating permanent records of their organizational accomplishments. Alliance patronage produces manuscripts, paintings, sculptures, and architectural decorations that subtly promote images of female authority and competence, gradually shifting cultural attitudes in ways that will influence future generations even without direct political organization. The Alliance develops sophisticated techniques for encoding their organizational knowledge within seemingly innocent cultural productions. Musical compositions contain mathematical relationships that preserve computational techniques. Textile patterns include geometric principles that demonstrate advanced mathematical understanding, and artistic decorations incorporate symbolic systems that future Alliance members can decode to access hidden knowledge about organizational methods and strategic thinking. International coordination of legacy projects proves particularly challenging as persecution intensifies and communication becomes increasingly dangerous. But Alliance members recognize that preserving their achievements requires global rather than regional efforts. You watch as they coordinate establishment of institutions across multiple countries, ensuring that their educational, legal, and cultural innovations will survive even if persecution eliminates them entirely from particular regions. Training successors represents perhaps the most crucial aspect of Alliance legacy planning, as aging leaders work to prepare younger women who can continue their work under changed conditions that will require different strategies and organizational approaches. These mentorship programs operate through seemingly conventional relationships between mothers and daughters, religious superiors and novices, and established women and their protégés that disguise intensive political education and strategic training. The documentation projects involve creating comprehensive records of Alliance methods, achievements, and strategic insights that could enable future women to rebuild similar organizations even without direct continuity from the original network. These documents require elaborate security measures to prevent discovery while ensuring accessibility to legitimate successors who possess appropriate knowledge and commitment. Financial endowments provide crucial support for legacy institutions by creating permanent funding sources that can maintain educational programs. Legal advocacy, and cultural activities even during periods when political organization becomes impossible. Alliance members systematically transfer resources into these endowments, using complex legal arrangements that protect funds from confiscation while ensuring continued availability for approved purposes. The Alliance's final coordination meetings focus on establishing communication protocols that will enable scattered survivors to maintain contact and potentially rebuild their organization after persecution subsides. These emergency procedures include recognition codes, safe house networks, and resource caches that could support future organizational development even if current institutional structures are completely destroyed. As you witness Alliance members completing their final legacy projects, carefully hiding documents that record their achievements while establishing institutions that disguise their revolutionary purposes within conventional appearances, you realize that their greatest victory lies not in temporary political influence, but in permanently altering medieval society's understanding of female capabilities. Even if persecution destroys their organization completely, the changes they've created in education, law, culture, and economic structures will provide foundations for future women's rights movements that will eventually achieve goals their medieval predecessors could only dream about. The final chapter of the Great Alliance begins not with dramatic confrontation but with quiet resignation. As you find yourself in 1389 walking through the empty corridors of what was once Fontevraud Abbey's bustling centre of international coordination. The silence echoes where urgent whispered conversations once planned strategies that shaped European politics, and dust gathers on writing desks where coded messages once travelled between distant kingdoms. The world has changed so fundamentally that the Alliance's revolutionary goals no longer seem revolutionary. Their very success has made their continued existence both unnecessary and impossible. The transformation reflects broader shifts in medieval society that the Alliance helped create but can no longer control or direct. You observe how the rise of stronger central governments, increased literacy among noble women, and growing acceptance of female participation in economic activities has gradually normalized many innovations that once required secret coordination to achieve. The legal precedents Alliance members established through decades of careful litigation now provide standard protections that individual women can claim without needing organizational support. Educational changes represent perhaps the most visible sign of the Alliance's ultimate success and obsolescence. Universities across Europe now regularly admit female students to courses that were exclusively male just generations earlier. While noble families routinely provide their daughters with classical education that rivals anything their sons receive, you watch as young women casually discuss philosophy, mathematics, and political theory in settings where such conversations would have been scandalous or dangerous during the Alliance's early years. Economic opportunities that once required Alliance coordination to access have become routine options for women with appropriate social connections and financial resources. Female merchants operate openly in major trading cities. Noble women manage extensive properties without male supervision, and even relatively modest families invest in their daughters' commercial education. The systematic economic discrimination that originally motivated alliance formation has given way to individual competition, where gender presents obstacles but not absolute barriers. The religious landscape has similarly transformed as female spiritual authority becomes increasingly accepted within Orthodox Christian institutions. Abbesses routinely participate in church governance. Female religious scholars contribute to theological debates, and women's mystical experiences receive official recognition rather than suspicious scrutiny. The theological arguments Alliance members develop to justify female spiritual leadership have become mainstream positions that require no special organization to maintain or defend. Political changes prove equally dramatic as royal courts across Europe routinely include female advisors. Noble marriages increasingly reflect mutual consent rather than parental arrangement, and inheritance laws provide stronger protections for female heirs. The systematic legal reforms Alliance members achieved through decades of strategic litigation have created new social norms that make continued organizational advocacy unnecessary for most practical purposes. Historians still argue whether the alliance's dissolution represents inevitable success or tragic defeat, but surviving members understand that their organization has become victim of its own achievements. The coordination that once provided crucial support for isolated women attempting to expand their influence is no longer necessary when individual women can achieve similar results through legitimate institutional channels. The generational transition accelerates the dissolution process as younger women who benefit from alliance achievements show little interest in maintaining organizational structures they've never needed to use. You observe how daughters and granddaughters of alliance founders pursue opportunities their predecessors created without recognizing the systematic coordination that made those opportunities possible, or understanding why such coordination might still be valuable for protecting and expanding women's rights. Personal factors contribute to organizational decline as aging alliance leaders face health problems, family obligations, and simple exhaustion after decades of intensive political activity. Eleanor of Aquitaine's death in 1204 removes their most visible leader and international coordinator, while other founding members gradually withdraw from active participation as their energy and enthusiasm wane with advancing age. Regional variations in social change create additional pressures for dissolution, as alliance members in different areas face dramatically different political situations that make unified responses increasingly difficult to coordinate. Women in some regions enjoy opportunities and protections that make alliance support unnecessary, while those in more conservative areas face dangers that make organizational participation too risky to continue. The communication networks that once provided alliance strength become liabilities as governmental surveillance capabilities improve, and secret correspondence attracts attention that individual women cannot afford to risk. You watch as alliance members gradually reduce their international correspondence, abandon coded communication systems, and focus on local rather than continental activities that require less coordination and create fewer security vulnerabilities. Economic changes that the alliance helped create ultimately undermine their organizational coherence as improved transportation, standardized currencies, and expanded trade relationships make individual women less dependent on alliance economic coordination. The mutual aid systems that once provided crucial support for members facing financial crises become less necessary as conventional banking, insurance, and commercial relationships offer similar services without requiring political organization. Religious institutional changes similarly reduce alliance relevance as the Church increasingly accepts female spiritual authority and intellectual participation that once required secretive coordination to achieve. The theological innovations alliance members develop to justify their activities have become accepted doctrine that individual women can invoke without needing organizational support. The legal systems that alliance members gradually transformed through strategic litigation now provide protections and opportunities that make continued legal advocacy less crucial for most women's immediate needs. The precedents they established have become established law that individual women can invoke through conventional legal channels without requiring specialized organizational expertise. Cultural transformations represent perhaps the alliance's most complete victory, as artistic, literary, and intellectual productions celebrating female achievement have become commonplace rather than revolutionary. The Cultural Renaissance Alliance patronage created has established new social norms that make continued cultural coordination unnecessary for maintaining female intellectual participation. The final meetings occur sporadically and informally as remaining alliance members gather for personal rather than organizational reasons, reminiscing about shared experiences while acknowledging that their systematic coordination has become anachronistic. You witness these quiet farewells between women who changed medieval history while recognizing that their success has made their continued organization both impossible and unnecessary. Documentation destruction becomes a final organizational priority as remaining alliance members systematically eliminate evidence that could endanger women who participated in their activities or create problems for institutions they established. The same secrecy that protected their organization during its active years now requires careful elimination of records that could compromise their legacy achievements. Individual members pursue various paths after organizational dissolution, with some retiring to religious contemplation, others focusing on family obligations, and a few continuing political activities through conventional channels that no longer require secret coordination. Their diverse post-alliance careers reflect both the opportunities their organization created and the social changes that made continued organization unnecessary. The wind that carries away the last autumn leaves from Fontevraud's courtyard seems to whisper secrets that will never again be shared, carrying with it the dreams and achievements of women who dared to imagine themselves as international political actors centuries before such concepts would be formally recognized. As the heavy abbey doors close for the final time on rooms that once buzzed with revolutionary planning, you realize that the Alliance's greatest victory lies not in its continuation, but in its successful transformation of medieval society to the point where women no longer need such secret organization to achieve what their grandmothers could only dream about. The gentle silence that settles over the empty abbey chambers carries within it the satisfaction of goals achieved and the melancholy of endings, as history's most successful medieval women's organization dissolves not in defeat but in triumph, having accomplished everything it set out to achieve and more. The Alliance members who created this moment of quiet success could never have imagined when they first gathered in these same halls that their greatest achievement would be making their own organization obsolete through the very changes they worked so hard to create. And so, as the last candles flicker in the abandoned scriptoriums where once revolutionary plans were written, you understand that the greatest organizations sometimes measure their success not by their survival, but by how completely they transform the world that created them. The Alliance of Medieval Women achieved something far more remarkable than simple political influence. They rewrote the fundamental assumptions of their society so thoroughly that future generations would take for granted opportunities that once required secret coordination and careful planning to achieve. Their story whispers to us across centuries, reminding us that change often comes not through dramatic gestures, but through patient, persistent work by people whose names history rarely remembers. The women who gathered in monastery chambers and corresponded through coded recipes created a revolution so complete that it became invisible, so successful that it made itself unnecessary as you drift towards sleep. Imagine those final Alliance members returning to their individual lives, carrying with them the satisfaction of having opened doors that would never again be closed. Their daughters and granddaughters would walk through these doors without knowing the struggles that made their passage possible, taking for granted freedoms that earlier generations had risked everything to achieve. The gentle rhythm of your breathing matches the quiet satisfaction of a story well told, of goals achieved, of a better world created through the careful work of women who understood that the most lasting changes happen slowly, carefully, almost invisibly. Their alliance may have dissolved, but their legacy lives on in every woman who assumes her right to education, property, and self-determination without questioning whether such assumptions are permitted. Sleep comes softly now, carrying with it dreams of medieval women who dared to imagine a different world and then had the patience, wisdom, and determination to create it. Their quiet victory echoes through the centuries, a reminder that ordinary people working together can achieve extraordinary things, even when history forgets their names.